Hello, welcome to the debate on Sky News. I'm Martin Stanford. Here's our take on developments brought together from America, the UK and around the world. Cranking up the rhetoric against Islamic State, but will the words be matched by actions?
Well, we are making a difference on the ground. We're now seeing the Daesh being hit in its own heartland.
Plus, China's slowdown as the Chinese economy catches a cold. Does the rest of the world get the financial flu? It looks like a new chapter in the fight against Daesh, or so-called Islamic State, is going to be opened. The British and American defence secretaries are meeting as we record this show with some of their European counterparts to work out how they can ramp up action against IS. Where are we in this fight? Here's the assessment of the British Defence Secretary.
Well, we are making a difference on the ground. We're now seeing the Daesh being hit in its own heartland. We're seeing attacks on its oil wells, and we're beginning to see attacks on its command and control buildings in Mosul, for example. So the Daesh is now under pressure. The task now is to capitalise on that and some of the setbacks they've had, and for the coalition now to really push forward and to identify how we can tighten the noose around the head of the snake, as I call it.
Well, as usual, the Democrat commentator Jeffrey Robinson is standing by in New York. Conservative commentator Armstrong Williams is in Washington, D.C. Jeffrey, do you think these airstrikes are having any effect?
They clearly are. I don't think it's a matter if we defeat ISIL. I think it's a question of when. And sooner rather than later would be good, but it has to do with the stomach we have for the fight. I worry about something, and it's this idea of the coalition. It is obviously good for all of Western Europe, especially Britain, to join the United States in this coalition, to bring in the Arab nations and to defeat ISIL as soon as possible. But there is a geopolitical side to this. And I think that there are senior voices in the British military who are saying that bombing, an increased bombing, will make Britain popular with the United States, but it may not make Britain safer. And there is this balance that has to be made between the countries. I go back to the Gulf War I, when France wanted to be seen helping the coalition to defeat Saddam Hussein. So the French sent an aircraft carrier into the Gulf. But France being French, they took the planes off first because it would be politically unwise to upset their big markets in the Middle East. So there are these geopolitical considerations, and I just wonder at what point does Britain say, yeah, sure, we'll continue the bombing and we'll add maybe some elite ground forces, but not a lot, and we're going to do whatever we have to do to be seen to be helpful. But we really don't want to go overboard and endanger our own territory by being too helpful.
And Armstrong, you don't think we should, either as UK or the USA, be doing much more than this bombing campaign? No troops, for instance?
Well, certainly not in the definition of having ground troops. I think that is a universal understanding that you don't want to see Western troops on the ground fighting Muslims. You want to be able to arm people who have proven to be allies in that region, like the Kurds, and those that we've built relationships and trust with in that region. I also think that it would be wise to not always discuss our strategy and how we move forward to fight ISIL. I do think it's important that we, in our own way, find a way to, off the record, talk to the Russians and talk to the Israelis about particularly tactics for that the Israelis have used that have the work proven to be very beneficial and very devastating in fighting our enemy and fighting this growing demon that continues to show itself with little resources in that region. I think airstrikes are fine as long as those airstrikes are targeted in a way where innocent civilians, the very people that we're trying to defend and trying to help them reclaim so much of the life that they've lost and they've suffered the most from this devastation. As long as these strikes are not killing innocent civilians. And then what you have to understand, when you have these airstrikes, you're just destroying infrastructure that's going to require great resources to rebuild these countries and these nations. And so I think it's important that the United States and our allies in that region work together. And we also build relationships that people that we sometimes may be at odds with, but also find that ISIL is just as a greater threat to them. I think we have to change our tactics. I think special ops is something that should not be off the table. You may have ground groups, but not in the sense and the understanding of the definition that we would think of them as. Sometimes we got to fight the devil sometimes with the devilish tactics.
Well, here's a guy who may be able to help us with the idea of special ops. Let's speak to Major General Chip Chapman, former head of British counterterrorism. He was a senior military advisor to US Central Command. And Major General, thank you for being with us today. Do you think the airstrike campaign is working as its designers hoped it would?
Well, you've got to understand what the airstrikes are about. And the airstrikes really are about containment, and that is stopping ISIL expanding their territory. So in that sense, they're correct. The British contribution to that can only be more than a minor thickening, because there is only one superpower and 90 to 95% of the strikes are from the US. But of course, a coalition is something you want, and UNSCR 2249 in November said that ISIL was an unprecedented threat to international peace and security and wanted every nation to join in taking them on.
When the British and American politicians are saying it's time to up the ante and to really push home their advantage, what do you think they've got in mind?
Well, I'm not too sure what that means, to be honest. I don't think there's anything wrong with the strategy. And although we heard about geopolitics, of course, the politics in each country still intrude. So, for example, I don't think, whilst you have 1 year left of an Obama administration, that you're going to have much more than is going on at the moment. We've already had an announcement in the last month that another 250 special operations forces will be going to the sort of Turkish-Syrian border to try and thicken up the training there. So in terms of the politics of both the UK and the US, what we're doing at the moment is probably appropriate. It's worth saying that I think ISIL have reached its zenith. CENTCOM have said that ISIL is in a defensive crouch. They've lost 30 to 40% of territory in Iraq. They've lost 17,000 square kilometres in Syria. They are certainly on the back foot, and you could see that from the pronouncements of Baghdadi in his sort of audio message of the 26th of December 2015.
I'll bring the others in a minute, but one more thought here, which I think everybody regards as the Americans didn't quite get right during Iraq, was what's next? What's the post-conflict plan? Do you think America, the UK, anyone else has got a post-conflict plan here?
Well, I think, again, if you look back to something that Bob Neller, who's the Commandant of the US Marine Corps, said in December, he sort of said, could we go to Raqqa and pound these guys into the ground? Absolutely. But then what? There's nothing there that I want. Who am I supposed to hand it over to? And this is a problem of governance, and it's a problem of legitimacy. We could go with a strong military force on the ground and take things out, but we'd be in the same dilemma as we had after the Iraqi invasion. It was the war which came after the war that we did not get right, and we cannot get that right without proxies and partners in the Middle East. It is partly their problem. We can help them with that problem. We cannot win it for them.
Let's bring in Jeffrey and Armstrong. Jeffrey, it's going to be about partnerships in the end.
Well, it's going to be about two things. It's certainly going to be about partnerships in the region, but it's also about Syria and getting rid of Assad. I don't think you can possibly have a solution to the ISIL problem as long as Assad's still around. I don't think you can have a suitable partnership with any of the people who might join us from Syria until you get rid of Assad. So it's an enormously complex situation, but it's not going to get solved by just bombing. I like the idea of drones, by the way. The Republicans are running around in their maniacal style saying carpet bomb them and we'll end it that way. We can't. You can't. I mean, it's stupid. You can't carpet bomb them.
That doesn't play with the American timetable, political timetable, does it? Because everyone's doing battle on the campaign trail. They're not really focused on what's next for northern Syria.
But you got to separate the campaign rhetoric that's being ratcheted up to the reality of the consequences of how we go forward in the decision making. You know, I would just be interested in, from the general, I'm just curious, and it's a take on what Jeffrey, was just talking about in getting rid of Assad. We always seem to think that getting rid of some bloody dictator is going to always pave the way for the successes that we're looking for. As the general looks back over the campaign by President Bush to go in Iraq, where we eliminated Saddam Hussein, and the way he was sort of like an effigy in his death, and how he's dragged down the streets a head of state, and those images that were left, even the loyalists to him. And then under Obama, we moved on to Libya, and we took out Muammar Gaddafi, and we saw what happened in the Arab states. And if we still had those despots in place today, wouldn't we be talking about something else instead of ISIS and the threat of ISIS?
Well, let's go to the Assad question first. The Assad question really does show the complexity of the geopolitics of the region. Certainly from the Sunni states, from the GCC states, Gulf Cooperation Council, they obviously want to see Assad go. Turkey wants to see Assad go. Iran wants to see Assad stay. Hezbollah want to see Assad stay, and the Russians want to see Assad stay. So you've got the complexity there of a lot of groups wanting different things. From the Saudi perspective, of course, this is partly a Saudi-Iranian Sunni-Shia split, and the complexity of that, which came out of both the nuclear deal with Iran and the fact that Saudi Arabia had a 34-nation alliance, but excluded Syria, excluded Iraq, and excluded Iran, shows the complexity of Syria. I'm slightly optimistic about the future of Iraq in the next year. I'm absolutely pessimistic about the future of Syria and any hope of a settlement there in the next year.
Can I just ask you about the borders? When you say you're optimistic about Iraq, under its present borders, or do you think a bit of redrawing of borders is inevitable, perhaps with both Iraq and Syria?
Well, certainly the pronouncements from the United States and the international community are that you should maintain the borders as they exist. That doesn't mean you'll have the same political settlement as currently exists. Whether you have confederation in Iraq is up for debate about how the Turkmen, how the Kurds, how the Shia, how the Sunnis actually govern themselves. Syria is just such a complex kaleidoscope of challenges at the moment that it's just difficult to see a way ahead there. The Israelis, for example, say that it will take 50 years to sort Syria out.
50? That's pessimistic by anyone's yardstick, Jeffrey. Let's pivot to the campaign, shall we? How would Hillary Clinton, I know your favoured candidate, sort this out?
Well, she's been very explicit on what she wants to do, and that's continue the bombing, maybe up the bombing, and use special forces, but form this coalition. I think she also understands that Syria is a real part of the problem. And this is not the same thing, as Armstrong has alluded to, Gaddafi, Mubarak, and Saddam Hussein. No, the Syrian situation, because they're in the midst of a civil war, some of the people who are fighting against Assad would probably join the coalition against ISIL, but they're already tied up. It's an enormously complex situation. And I kind of wonder, because the general said 50 years. I wonder, just from a military standpoint, if what we're seeing now is not a precursor to what militaries will be in 50 years. I mean, is the future of the American and British military an elite strike force, pilotless air forces, drones, Mach 3 cruise missiles on surface seaborne platforms? Or are we still going to have a big cavalry and tanks just in case the Russians decide to come across the German border? I mean, we can't afford both. And it looks to me like we have to make a choice eventually. What do you think it'll be?
Well, actually, the Global Risks 2016 paper has come out in the last week, and it sort of said in the security sphere that you've actually got both of those problems. You have the problem of fragile states and the military, which might deal with that, and I'll come on to that in a minute. And secondly, you have the interest on the developed states still, which would need a maintenance of aircraft carriers, tanks and things like that. You could see a strategy of how you might take places like Raqqa, and it isn't, as people perceive, like a kind of Stalingrad, and it would need an investment force, which needs to be both coalition and from the Gulf states. It would use persistent surveillance from drones to identify the targets and to stop ISIL manning bulldozer blitzkrieg and all the artillery systems and things like that. It would lead to cyber warfare where we knock out all their means of communication and go dark. And then it would need a listening campaign so that when we see them from the persistent drone strikes, we would take them out with aircraft. And that would be with very few casualties, as we sort of saw in the retaking of Ramadi recently. So you have a force for that, and you still need a force while the Russian bear seems to be at least unleashing its claws slightly.
Major General Chip Chapman, thank you for being with us today. A reminder, you can catch up with the Sky News debate on Apple TV, Roku and Catch Up, and of course at skynews.com/US. Next, is the tiger losing its roar? China has reported a slowing of its rate of growth, its lowest rate for a quarter of a century. If the workshop of the world is being hard hit, should we be worried? Well, Gabriel Wildau is the Financial Times correspondent in Shanghai. Has this taken even the Chinese by surprise?
I don't think it's taken the Chinese by surprise. China's economy has actually been slowing for the last 5 years. So what we saw was another notching down of growth last year. And Chinese leaders are facing some serious difficulties in their own economy, where we see that the engines of the economy that have really driven China's economic miracle over the last 3 decades, those traditional growth engines are now in pretty deep trouble. So we're talking about heavy industry, we're talking about coal mining, we're talking about real estate and infrastructure construction. So China's leadership has a big challenge when it comes to maintaining employment, maintaining social stability for a whole generation of young Chinese that have really known nothing but prosperity. I think, though, when we're looking at the impact for the global economy and for the U.S. in particular, the picture is less bleak. The U.S. economy isn't that exposed to China, at least not directly.
And what about Europe? Because I suppose if we're concerned about our own backyard, various European nations have got quite used to exploiting this growth of China, haven't they?
They have. So smaller economies like Germany, which is certainly a large economy compared to its European neighbors, but is small compared to the U.S., a country like Germany really generates a lot of its growth by exporting to China. And many German companies have been quite successful in selling heavy machinery and engineering services to China. So they have reason to be concerned, and especially those who've been feeding those traditional growth engines. On the other hand, if you look at economies like the UK, for example, they're actually well poised to benefit from a transition underway in the economy where these traditional growth drivers, the heavy industry, is declining, but we're seeing a growth in the new economy in China, notably the services sector. So for a country like the UK, they're very well suited to be exporting services like education, entertainment and culture, healthcare, and not only to be exporting them, but for British companies to be investing in China and providing those services directly. So the impact on other countries really depends on where you stand and what kind of goods and services you specialize in.
For the American big tech giants, I'm thinking they've got something of a schizophrenic relationship with China, haven't they? Because much of the manufacturing for their profit comes from Chinese factories, but they also have the downside of a lot of their goods and services being copied and cloned in China.
That's right. Of course, some of the most familiar tech names like Twitter and Facebook are banned in China. The internet censors don't allow me and Chinese citizens living in China to access those websites. Other tech companies like Uber, for example, is actually growing quite swiftly here. They are invested directly on the ground providing local services. The companies that rely on tech components, on purchasing tech components from China are also in a pretty good position, because what we're seeing in China is actually deflation, which is very bad for China's economy, but is probably good for companies like Apple that source tech components from China. The prices for the components they source are going down.
Let's bring in Jeffrey in New York and Armstrong standing by in Washington. Armstrong, you're a businessman. Do you think you or your business sector will be affected by a China slowdown?
You know, it's interesting listening to this conversation because this slowdown has been going on for a little over a decade, and the slowdown on this economy in China will have negative impacts on the markets that are closely related to the economy. One of them being the USA, in our country, a decrease in the level of consumer spending will affect the U.S. exports negatively. And if the U.S. is not successful, Martin, in sort of shifting to other markets, then based on the GDP formula, a decrease in our U.S. GDP, at least in the short run, can be expected. And I also think in terms of the exports decreasing and imports being less affected from those negative developments, and it will have an impact on the deficit in the U.S. balance of trade with China. I think will widen even further in the long run. And I also think, and your guests can comment on this, if China continues to evolve unfavorably in the United States' economy, is going to be through the selling of these treasury securities. The Chinese government may want to sell off part of these securities to use the proceeds for economic stimulus. All these things should be of great concern because especially with the selling off of this economic stimulus, it could be a potential massive selling of the U.S. Treasury securities, which creates a real threat to our U.S. economy.
Gabriel, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I mean, people have talked a lot about the impact and the potential risks from China's role in the U.S. Treasury market. I think those concerns are probably overblown. The U.S. Treasury market is very liquid. Yes, China's purchase of U.S. Treasuries is falling, and in fact, they're selling U.S. Treasuries on a net basis as they try to combat some of the very severe capital outflow that their economy is experiencing. But there are plenty of buyers for U.S. Treasuries, and in fact, we see that the Treasury yields are still very low. In fact, there are indications that that because investors are worries about a U.S. recession are starting to pick up. We're seeing Treasury yields actually come down despite the raising of interest rates by the Federal Reserve.
Jeffrey, it's interesting that Gabriel talks about a recession. The American economy, though, is on a little uptick here, isn't it? I mean, you've brought interest rates back from their almost zero or negative. Is it going to be adversely affected by this problem, the other side of the world?
Well, we live in a global village, to use a very bad term. And yes, what happens if China sneezes, other people can catch a cold. Japan certainly is very vulnerable. What worries me about China is several things. And it all has to do with the balance of trade between the U.S. and China. We need a two-way trade, but it has to be a level playing field. And I don't think a lot of companies trust China. I don't know that we can trust their figures. I think their level of corporate espionage and stealing of intellectual property is way out of control. And I don't know what's being done on a serious basis, except shallow promises from the Chinese government that, no, we're not doing it, when in fact there's an entire military brigade-size operation in Beijing that is aimed at doing nothing but stealing intellectual property from the West. I worry about Hong Kong and the promises that were made about keeping Hong Kong free, and those of the Chinese government is now reneging on some of them. And I worry mostly about the manipulation of the yuan. For them to fool around with their currency has serious trade effects on us. And until they start playing as mature, honest brokers in this world trade market, we have a lot to worry about. And they're not doing that now.
And Gabriel, what about India? What about Japan? Are there repercussions closer to China that may well be felt in their economies too?
I think so. Certainly, Japan is more exposed to China as a share of their economy than the U.S. I think, though, the countries where we're going to see the biggest impact from the Chinese slowdown are the commodity-producing countries. And in fact, we're already seeing that over the last year with the collapse in commodity prices. We're talking about crude oil, we're talking about iron ore, we're talking about copper. These countries that, again, have grown very rich over the last 10, 15 years selling these products, Australia, Brazil, Russia, much of Africa, Latin America, these countries, which are not really selling value-added product and services, but just pulling stuff out of the ground and selling it to China, with the transition underway in China's economy towards services and away from heavy industry, the demand for these commodities is no longer what it was. And countries that have based their economies around selling these products to China are really feeling the pain. But countries like Japan are still, I mean, the high-tech products that Japan sells, I mean, China's consumers are going to continue to demand those things, even if they demand, you know, less steel and copper wire. So you know, again, it depends on where you stand.
Gabriel Wildau, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Shanghai. Now, let me check a thing or two with our state-of-the-art modern media men. I'm going to ask you about passwords, because a survey just out found that in 2015, guess what the most popular passwords were? They are, and here they come, 123456 and password. How about that? Things haven't really changed. Jeffrey Armstrong, tell me you do better than that. Jeffrey, what's your password? Well, don't tell me what it is, but have you changed it? And is it something more complicated than that?
Yes, because when you reach Armstrong's age, you can't remember anything except password and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So what I do, and I worry seriously about so many people, banks and companies I deal with online who ask for my mother's maiden name. What I do to protect myself is I change my mother every 6 months.
Armstrong, what do you do for those multiple passwords you have to try and remember?
You know, Jeffrey, I really appreciate all your flattery. But I must tell you, our passwords and usernames are so complicated. You will have a very hard time cracking our systems. That's why they've never been cracked. You know, Martin, we change our passwords and usernames every 3 months without delay, every 3 months. And sometimes it comes from something that may happen on an air flight, something that funny may happen. It's the craziest things that we come up with. It'll be very difficult for someone cracking our passwords. Well, it hasn't happened yet.
Well, fingers crossed. Thank you both very much indeed, and we wish you well. And that's it for this edition of The Debate. You can continue watching Sky News on Apple TV, Roku and Catch Up, and of course on skynews.com. Until next time, goodbye.